Hello, this is Andrew Wright, and this is my presentation on a research article that uses multiple moderated regression, and it's from the Journal of Addictive Behaviors, Relationship among Alcohol Use, Gender Problems, and Symptoms of Psychological Distress, Gender as a Moderator in a College Sample. So this is basically what I'll be looking at, the problem that the researchers investigated, their research design, especially why they chose moderated regression, multiple regression, and then their findings and the discussion of the research. So the research questions. Firstly, what is the prevalence of psychological distress among a large random sample of college students? To what degree are the symptoms of alcohol use and related negative consequences? And thirdly, are there gender-specific relationships among alcohol use, alcohol consequences, and psychological distress? So, why do this research? The authors point out that drinking is extremely common in college, and heavy drinking is surprisingly, well, depending on your viewpoint, common. And that students who abuse alcohol are at a high risk for negative consequences. They also thought it was surprising that there were high levels of stress among students. So just a couple of jokes here before we get into it. So what it says is, hey, the good news, he got a 3.0. The bad news is it's his blood alcohol content. And then, you don't have a college degree? Where did you do all your drinking? So, what do both these jokes have in common, apart from them being around alcohol consumption among college males? Well, they both refer to a college male who drinks too much. And that's interesting because it's not as likely you would have a joke about a female who drinks too much. That carries different consequences, and we know that as a society at some level. And so that sort of is the meat that the authors are investigating here. How does gender relate to drinking and psychological symptoms? And so the variables selected is an independent variable, alcohol consumption, standard drinks per week. The moderating variable is sex, it's male, female, and the dependent variable, psychological symptoms. Well, why choose these variables? So they said that past studies have revealed gender differences in drinking patterns and mental health problems, and they say that the link is understudied in college students, and preliminary research had suggested the relationship between drinking and mood might be stronger for men and women. Well, and so what they expected to find? They expected to find that men drank more than women, that women have more symptoms of psychological distress than men, and that symptoms of psychological distress would be positively related to alcohol use and negative consequences from that use. So why choose multiple regression? Well, so the researchers wanted to know whether gender would moderate the relationships among alcohol use, alcohol-related problems, symptoms of psychopathology. So a moderator is a variable that affects the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. In other words, it doesn't, so in this case of alcohol, psychological stress, being male or female is not causing the stress, generally, but it's affecting the magnitude of that stress that comes with drinking. And it's a little more subtle than that, but that's the general idea, that it affects the way the independent variable acts on the dependent. And we're doing regression because we have a continuous variable, alcohol, and ordinal, psychological health, and a dichotomous variable is the moderator, sex. And so the sample, so they had 3 West Coast universities, pretty good sized sample size, over 1,700, about twice as many women as men, and they completed web assessments. And they did not use any moderators of age or race. That would also be interesting, but they did not do that. They just kept it to gender. So there's schools. So I found there's actually some research done on the top 100 U.S. party colleges. 2 of the top 20 are from the West Coast. Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, Chico State. So where does Idaho fall on that? Did we make the top 100? Yes, we do. And number 1, if you're interested, is Florida State. So the data collection. There were 3 assessment instruments. The first was a daily drinking questionnaire. They had to fill in 7 boxes, a day for each week, with alcohol consumption on that day averaged over the past 3 months. Then there's the Rutgers Alcohol Problem Index, where they rate occurrence of 23 items related to the impact of alcohol in their life. And then lastly, it's the brief symptom inventory, where they check symptoms among 53 items, and including subscales for 9 symptom dimensions. You know, and most commonly depression, anxiety, stigmatization, and so on. So the results, and we'll talk a little bit more about that inventory as we move on here, but the results. So alcohol consumption, so univariate analysis, the results revealed that men reported greater consumption than women. That's 6 versus 3.5 drinks per week. And the reason I mentioned reported there is that this is, we'll talk about this a little later, but a weakness in that it's reported. And then psychological stress. So those under stress conserve more and consume more alcohol. And you can see that both these results are very strong effects, less than 0.0001. It's partly due to the really good sized sample, but even so, that's pretty significant. And continuing with the results, multivariate results were significant for both gender and GSI scores. Let's bring that up. And GSI is the Global Severity Index. It's part of the BSI, Brief Symptom Inventory, I mentioned previous slide, a couple slides ago. So you can see again, pretty huge. So what that's basically saying is that both sex, male versus female, are significant, and when we go into this GSI, that was also very significant, and it was very significant men versus women. I'll talk about that a little more in the discussion. So, but what does this mean? It's probably a little easy to understand on a graph. And so if we look at them, I have 2 here that they included in the research. So we have standard drinks per week. And then on the side here, so up to 13 drinks per week, 1 to 13. And then there's a low GSI and a high GSI. I think they basically pulled the GSI out. They don't say this because it gave the most significant results of all the indicators of psychological distress. So, men, women. So you can see significantly more drinks per week, even at a mean level, men than women. Then, and then that is even more true for those exhibiting significant psychological symptoms. of distress, even more, getting up to almost double there. Males versus females, and then looking at the alcohol problems index. So in other words, what we're relating is the alcohol problems index against the global severity index of more general psychological distress. And we can see that when there's low levels of distress, there's no difference between men and women in the alcohol problems. But then we come up here to the high levels of distress, and it's becoming really quite significantly different. And yeah. So then, so discussing this, so not only did men drink more than women, but they were more likely to do so when under stress, and that this drinking was more likely to lead to further problems. And so, as we just saw in the graphs, those in psychological distress reported more alcohol-related problems. Again, very significant effect, and that the relationship between stress and drinking was stronger for men than women. So the limitations of the study, overall it's a good study. As the authors noticed, it was cross-sectional. And cross-sectional means that it was not, there were no repeated measures over time. It was a one-time thing, so it's a cross-section. And the results were self-reported, and I had this criticism myself. And so basically, it doesn't take into account whether there are any differences in how men and women report or notice their symptoms, and it doesn't. And same for those under psychological distress. Are there differences in how they report and how they would notice what's going on for them? Okay, so the strengths of study, and it definitely had some. So the firstly is by using both sex and GSI as moderators, the researchers were able to make some pretty subtle and powerful distinctions about the subject's behavior with regards to alcohol and psychological distress, de-stress. And it's really quite clever. So they already had gender as one moderator, and then they were able to look at certain kinds of distress reported because it was, divided up into various categories, and that is what enabled them to do it as a multiple regression. Very clever, well done, clear results. Massive sample size, 1700 over, which gave a huge amount of power, but it was, to me, the results were so significant that it would have worked with a pretty small sample size. And then I also like they're able to draw some conclusions, make some suggestions about giving more attention. Most of them are giving more attention to potential drinking problems and consequences of those drinking problems and levels of distress among male college students. And so I also thought that was good. And so there it is in a nutshell. It's quite a nice study, quite nice use of multiple moderated regression in the study. Thank you.